Hello, today on my channel you will hear an amazing story about life. I hope you enjoy this story. This one struck me to the core. Honestly, I still can't forget it. Enjoy watching. Well, Chuck, let's go. Let's see if the city guests left anything interesting for us in the woods, said smiling Danny Whitmore to his faithful four-legged friend, while getting ready for a walk in the woods. Chuck, a big red 3-year-old dog, looking like a mixture of a Scottish sheepdog and a common mutt, only happily barked. He was always happy when his master took him into the woods, because there were many exciting things for this pet Danny to do every time, from hunting for birds singing everywhere and small rodents to finding aromatic remnants of human food, which involuntarily made the dog drool. Good dog, Danny muttered, scratching him between the ears. Danny, in fact, had been homeless for many years. The young man who celebrated his 30th birthday this year was used to loneliness, and only Chuck considered his best friend and true companion in his street business. He found Chuck when he was just a baby. Someone had put a box of puppies in the trash, and Danny, walking by, saw that there was only one left in it. A sadly whimpering, thick reddish chocolate, cold baby. He felt sorry for the poor guy. Apparently he was weaker and smaller than the rest of his brethren, since he had been left in the back row. However, the stray needed a loyal friend in the first place, and then a guard dog, which could easily turn Chuck out with proper nutrition and care. Wrapping the puppy in his jacket, Danny brought him to his place in the basement of an old apartment building. This place had been his home for the last couple of years. That's when he came up with the name Chuck. Throwing an old backpack over his shoulders, Danny set off with Chuck into the nearest woods, which were behind the far railway bridge. The high-rise in which he lived was on the outskirts of their small provincial town, so it was a short walk to the woods. The young vagabond went there with a very specific purpose. In the first place, in the woods one could always find glassware, empty liquor bottles left over from the picnics of young city rich people who had long ago made the cannon a favorite place for their get-togethers. That way they had food to eat and a couple of buckets to sell at the town market. Wasn't that a seasonal earner? Along with collecting bottles of waste paper and scrap metal, with which Danny managed to survive even in the harshest of times. The boy didn't grumble at his fate, though he wanted more. He only tried not to be discouraged, and tried to earn a little money every day in this way, enough to feed himself and his friend for his favorite dry food. Danny walked through the woods now and then, deftly tromping through the grass with the long, thick branch he had so fortunately discovered today at the very entrance to the woods. Chuck ran faithfully alongside, sniffing the green grass and the roots of the trees in his path. Suddenly the dog froze, stood upright. Chuck's ears perked up and his face took on a wary expression. He obviously smelled something. What is it, Chuck? Why did you stop? Squirrels, or what did you see? At the same second, a woman's heartbreaking scream came to Danny's ears. Help! The woman screamed with rage. Somebody save me, they're killing me. Chuck, as if on cue, sprinted toward the old swamp, which was in the very center of the forest belt. Local mushroom hunters knew it was very dangerous to walk there. The soil was so quick and wet. Danny ran after the dog, and after a couple of 100 yards, he saw a tall black SUV standing alone in the middle of the woods. The car's doors were wide open, but there was no one inside. I don't like this, Chuck, he said quietly to his shaggy friend, but he only wagged his tail and rushed on. After walking a few dozen more steps, the homeless man heard a woman screaming again. Only this time it was joined by another male full of anger and hatred. Shut up, you bastard. Shut up, or it will be worse. By God, I'll drown you right here and nobody will find you, do you hear me? Nobody will find you, do you hear me? Danny slowly pulled apart the branches of the bushes and saw a tall young man about his age, holding a young, pretty blonde girl by the collar of her jacket. The horror of the situation was that the girl was literally hanging over the murky, greenish surface of the deep swamp. She desperately clutched her thin arms into the powerful shoulders of her abuser and looked at him with unspeakable pleading in her eyes. The girl's legs were raised on tiptoe, separated from the water by only a couple of millimeters of slimy earth. Please, please, she whispered. You know that's not going to solve anything. I don't care, the killer screamed in her face. All I want is to never see you in my life again, ever. I hate you. You know that, don't you? I hate you. Danny felt a fit of righteous indignation over him. What on earth was that? In broad daylight, not shying away from trying to kill a man. In the opinion of the homeless man, that was sheer lawlessness. Get away from the girl, you bastard, shouted Whitmore to the scoundrel while he came out of his hiding place openly. And he began to unambiguously step on the scoundrel. He turned around and quickly looked the tramp over from head to toe and only threw in a harsh tone. Man, you'd better walk away. It's got nothing to do with you. It's not your fight. Danny wouldn't back down. The tramp blew his whistle softly, and out of the bushes came Chuck, who had been lurking and waiting for his master's order, barking at the scoundrel. Oh, shit, the man exclaimed in surprise, and released the girl from his grasp. She shrieked loudly and fluttered her arms and immediately fell into the swamp. No, she screamed, choking on the muddy water and sludge. Please help me, save me! The poor woman was floundering in the green mud, flailing her hands desperately over the water. The rascal, cursing the dog clutched in his arm, somehow tossed it away from him and rushed sharply toward his Sophieu. Danny's stern gaze escorted him out. Oh no, you won't get away with it, you bastard, the tramp muttered to himself. He grabbed a huge rock that had fallen one step from his foot. Danny threw it in one precise movement toward the expensive car. Its driver was already starting the engine, intending to flee from the scene of the nearly accomplished crime, when he received a powerful blow on the trunk of the car with a boulder in the road. Asshole! Danny yelled at the man, at the same time turning around to try to assess the damage to his property. Danny had always been accurate. Even when he and his buddies played knife ball as kids, he always hit the exact target. Now, there was an impressive deep dent in the trunk of the car, and the left taillight was smashed to smithereens. The killer's driver wagged his finger at his temple, saying, "You're out of your mind," but he had no desire to find out. The stranger accelerated with all his might and sped out of the woods. Chuck had already tried to save the girl from the swamp. The dog got as close to the water as he could and grabbed the edge of her cloak with his teeth and pulled the poor girl to the shore. Danny, too, wasted no time in reaching for the victim and handing her the long stick he'd been using to search the grass for mushrooms and scattered glassware. The girl grasped the branch with her free hand, with the other weakly trying to row, helping the dog pull her. Finally, with great difficulty, Danny and the dog managed to pull the girl to shore. The homeless man and the drenched blonde lay on the bank, trying to catch his breath while Chuck, barking, circled around them. Hush, hush, Chuck. Calm down, the homeless man told him. He looked at the girl sideways while he did so. More than once, Danny had heard gruesome stories on television about how greedy husbands tried to get rid of their rich wives in such a savage way, luring them into the woods, and then arranging their allegedly in an accident. Surely the same thing must have happened here. Thank you. The blonde sincerely thanked him, and now that she'd recovered her senses a little. If it weren't for you and your wonderful dog, I'd be at the bottom of this swamp feeding leeches. The girl went pale and adjusted the collar of her wet blouse, obviously remembering the hatred with which the bastard looked at her. She was shaking, Danny thought, so shivering from the stress and hypothermia of being in the water so long. You're welcome. He just answered her. Chuck and I walk here all the time. It's just lucky that he heard you first. He let me know right away which direction to go. The girl looked him straight in the eye, then held out her frail hand. My name is Claire. Chuck, you're a wonder, not a dog, she said, turning to the dog. The dog was happy to run up to the girl, and then he patted her neck with his wet, cold nose. Claire laughed and patted the shaggy rescuer's silky fur. Danny, the homeless man briefly introduced himself. Then he gently shook Claire's hand and noticed a thin band of a gold wedding ring on her ring finger. The tramp's gaze upon the jewel was not lost on the girl, so she spoke quickly. "This scary man you saved me from, Danny, is my husband," Claire explained. "I recently found out he had a mistress. Of course I was very upset, but I was angry too. He was going to marry her. The horny bastard, you know." Shadow of anger, hurt, and resentment ran across Claire's face. He and I had been married for almost 3 years. And now this. Claire involuntarily twirled the ring as if it were hard for her to remember. "We had a big fight a week ago, but it was his own fault. Not only had he decided to start a new life with that tramp, but he wanted some of my money for himself." Danny looked at her understandingly. His theory seemed to be beginning to prove itself. "Yes, I really am very rich," Claire nodded, catching his gaze. "And of course I wasn't going to sponsor him. I told him that my lawyers would do everything so that he would not only be left without a cent after the divorce, but he would not be able to get a job in any decent place. He would sleep on the street. And you see how he decided to get my inheritance over my dead body." At this point, the tears rolled down the girl's cheeks. "He at this point swore to me 3 days ago that he broke up with her." Wiping her eyes with his fist, he said, "Come on, Claire, let's make it up to you." Kind of admitted he was wrong. "This relationship on the side was one big mistake. I thought he was really scared of the consequences and decided to use his head, come to his senses. He invited me to the picnic, and then you saw for yourself." Claire shuddered and sobbed, ready to burst into tears. "Your situation is not an easy one," Danny agreed and rubbed his stubbly chin thoughtfully. "And I was a fool to get so excited." She kicked herself. "It was only when we drove into the middle of nowhere that I realized there would be no picnic. I don't know what got into him." Claire sighed sorrowfully. She'd never seen him like that before. He looked like he'd gone mad. Danny looked at Claire with sincere sympathy, but didn't know what else he could do to help her. Suddenly, Claire looked at him strangely, and then she said, "You know, Danny, you're a very good man. I haven't met anyone like you in a long time. You not only saved my life, but finally opened my eyes to my man. Oh, he's going to be in trouble when I get back." Claire squinted her blue eyes slightly, and then, as if she had switched to a click, cheerfully said, "Listen, can you write down your information for me? Do you have a piece of paper and a pen?" Danny looked at her questioningly. "What's that for?" "I want to thank you," the girl answered, not the least bit embarrassed. "I have a brand new Lexus in the garage from my dead father. He didn't even have time to drive it. And I don't like such big cars. They're not convenient for me, so I want to sign this Lexus over to you." Danny didn't immediately believe what he was hearing. "Wow." That's all he could say. "Don't be, Claire. I didn't save you for a reward. I was just trying to be human, so to speak." But the young rich girl shook her head. "That's right. You and Chuck saved me, and I never forget kindness. Write me your information, and tomorrow come to the Central Notary's office. You know where it is. The green columns are there too." Danny nodded silently. "You give your name to George Rader, the notary, and he'll give you the deed of gift. I'll try to have the paperwork done by tonight so you can get the car out of the garage tomorrow." Claire slowly rose to her feet, and Danny stomped on the spot. Amazed by the girl's generosity, he just did not know what words to thank her. "Can I ask you something else?" Claire asked him. "Can you walk me to the bus stop? I'm still wet as an otter. If I get lost, I'm afraid all your efforts will go to waste." Danny and the dog walked Claire to the bus stop and put her on the bus to town. Before doing so, the young homeless man wrote down all his details on a piece of paper he had torn out of an old notebook he always carried with him in his backpack, just in case. After this, they said goodbye, and Claire left, leaving Danny in pleasant amazement and impatience. Danny spent the rest of the day mildly excited. To think that he would have a real Lexus, what a truly royal gift, thought to himself, and felt as if nightingales were singing in his soul at that moment. The young man's heart began to beat faster. Every time he imagined the new life that would surely begin for him with the arrival of this luxurious car. "We'll sell this Lexus," he said to Chuck while he was peeling potatoes, which he was going to boil for dinner that night, and buy a small house for the money, somewhere in the countryside, so that it would be cheaper. Chuck looked at the owner with his smart black eyes and yowled thinly, saying that it was a good idea. "I approve." "You know what the best part is?" Danny asked with a dreamy smile on his face. "That we'll still have money left over for a simple car of some kind?" The guy sighed sweetly and put the potatoes in a pot of water. "We'll taxi with you, we'll earn money. We'll feel like real people. Right, Chuck?" The dog cheerfully barked twice, which in dog language surely meant, "That's right." "You're doing the right thing, Master." Danny nodded happily to his dog, and when they had dinner and it was time to go to bed, he couldn't sleep for a long time yet. Young man could not wait until morning to go to the notary and see with his own eyes the reward he had been promised. The guy spent the whole night imagining himself stroking the perfectly clean, gleaming surface of the Lexus and getting into that leather interior. God, yes. Other poor souls like me would die of envy when they found out. Danny dreamed enthusiastically. To think what a miracle had happened to me. The homeless man only fell asleep in the morning, but not for long. In his dream, he was already living in a nice big house and driving a good quality car, working as a cab driver and earning as much money per month as he had never imagined before. Barely waiting until 10 o'clock, which was the time when the notary's office started, Danny flew there as if wings had literally sprouted behind his back. He had never felt so close to starting a new life. It seemed to the young man that only the threshold of the office separated him from normal human existence. God, I'll say my name and I'll have the car in my hands, Danny thought to himself as he approached the green pillars Claire had told him about. But he couldn't get inside. As soon as he entered the spacious hallway of the building, Danny immediately ran into a tall, puffy guard whose suit seemed ready to burst at the mere careless movement of its wearer. The big man looked at Danny with a harsh look that did not promise the homeless man anything good. "Where do you think you're going, sir?" the guard asked him sternly. "Are you sure you're not mistaken? The homeless shelter is right down the street to the left." Danny looked up at him, for the big man was almost a head taller than he was. "You don't understand. I have an appointment," he tried to explain. "I have to see George Rader, the notary. I have to get a power of attorney for my Lexus car today." The guard stared at the strange visitor for a few seconds and then laughed out loud in surprise, so that he even had to wipe away the tears of laughter. "Are you serious?" the guard asked him. "A Lexus for you? Why not a Lamborghini or a Ferrari at least?" Danny felt incredibly annoyed and humiliated. Obviously, the stupid jock had no idea that such a happy accident could happen to a simple homeless man. "Can you just take me to Rader?" Again, but more insistently, Whitmore asked him. "If you don't believe me, ask George Rader. He'll confirm it. I'm supposed to be credited with the Lexus, and there's absolutely nothing funny about it." Danny felt himself boiling up inside. What a horrible attitude towards people in this seemingly prestigious and widely known place for all the townspeople. However, the homeless man did not lose his determination, though his nerves were beginning to give out little by little. "What right do you have to talk to me like that?" Danny couldn't stand it. "I have just as much reason to be here as any of your other clients." The guard's eyes flashed with contempt and obvious sarcasm. "Our customers you're talking about are all dressed in suits and have their wallets full," the guard said, with an unpleasant smile. "But we don't serve any homeless people off the street. So you better get the hell out of here before I call the cops. Or do you want to wait in our back room in a pretzel post for the cops?" The big man wasn't lying, judging by the way his big knuckles crunched menacingly in his hands. Danny realized that he simply would not be allowed to see the notary and was ready to begin to break into his office with a fight. Pretending to leave, the man seized the moment and quickly slipped under the arm of the tall guard. Another second and Danny was almost on the stairs leading to the second floor when he felt someone dashing his arm behind his back, causing the homeless man to crouch with unbearable pain in his elbow and shoulder. "You don't seem to understand good sense at all, do you?" the guard bellowed in his ear, but Danny only shouted as hard as he could. "Let me go. How can you do this to people? I have to get my Lexus back." The young man was ready to cry. He was so hurt and offended. At that moment, a stately elderly man in his 60s came down the stairs to them. He was the chief notary in the local office, who handled most of the company's most expensive cases. "What's going on here?" he asked, as he watched the bouncer hold crying bum in his steel grip. "Yeah, there's a lump from the mountain," the big guy said rudely, nodding at Danny, demanding some kind of raider, saying he's supposed to get him cars. The notary made a sign to the guard, who reluctantly let the homeless man go. "Young man, what on earth are you doing?" he asked Danny. "We don't have an employee named Raider." "And what kind of car is this? Are you drunk?" Danny looked at him with a last hopeful look in his eye. "But how could it be?" He spoke slowly, tears welling up in his eyes. "Yesterday, Claire's girlfriend was supposed to give me the Lexus for helping her out in the woods. She said I should go to a notary named Raider, who did the deed to the Lexus for me. She said I just have to come in, identify myself, and they'll give me the documents for the car and then the car itself." The notary looked at him with mute amazement. "But I'm telling you, he's a total psycho." The guard couldn't help the insult. "Let me call the police, and they'll deal with him quickly. They'll give him the Lexus and the Peugeot and everything in between." But the man in the business suit only shook his head. "No, Harris, wait. Look," he turned to Denny. "I don't know who you helped or who promised you or what, but I swear to you if we had a Raider notary working for us, and it was indicated that we had a Raider notary working for us, and it was indicated that we had car papers ready for you, we'd let you through without question, I swear. We value our reputation." But the notary shook his hands and looked sadly at the young tramp. "No one asked us to do this. There was no Lexus, you understand. I'm sorry, but I'm afraid if what you say is true, then you've just been duped." It was as if something broke inside Danny, and only now he realized that he had been fooled in the most brazen and unconscionable way. "I'm sorry," he whispered in a low voice. "I must have really made a mistake. I'd better go. Good day, citizen." The notary nodded calmly, looking at Danny with sincere sympathy. Unfortunately, he had seen many times how cruelly deceived people who found themselves below the line of normal human life, so he was well aware of what Danny was going through. The boy, on the other hand, walked slowly along the street and thought about his unenviable position. Why did that Claire have to cheat on him so meanly? He had saved her life. She laughed at him. And that was all. What kind of people are they? Why were their hearts so stony? Danny had no answer to these questions, but he was greatly disappointed and annoyed by what had happened. Sitting down on a bench near the mall, Danny propped his head up and clutched his eyes tightly shut for a few seconds, trying to cope with the sorrowful feelings that came over him at that moment. All the dreams he'd built so carefully the day before were gone, like smoke in a few moments. How hard it would be for him to go back to his usual life, now that he had lost the chance for a much better and happier future. "So much for the Lexus, you naive fool," Danny scolded himself, remembering his own past. He had grown up in a family of alcoholics until he was 5. His mother and father drank from morning till night, so that they did not remember themselves and they could not take care of their young son. Thank God, kind neighbors sometimes came and took the boy to their place so he wouldn't see all this drunkenness and debauchery. And then there was a terrible fire in their apartment. Everything burned to the ground. Both Danny's parents and their 2 drunken drinking buddies were burned alive. The firefighters then determined that the cause of the fire was a trivial cigarette butt that the boy's father had forgotten to put out and had fallen asleep with it. After that, the boy was sent to an orphanage. Danny grew up in the orphanage until his majority, and all the while he could not reconcile himself with the harsh discipline of the parish. The other kids didn't like him much, and they tried to hurt him every chance they got. It was because Danny had grown up very fair and couldn't stand human greed and cruelty. Danny would often run away and spend hours wandering around the city, dreaming of how his life would change when he could finally leave these dreary, gloomy walls. After the orphanage, however, he was never able to get on with his own life in a human way. Up to the age of over 20, he was still somehow floundering, trying to find a job and settle down in society. And then the young man did not even notice how he got addicted to alcohol. At first he started drinking with a couple of random friends, and they actually turned out to be black realtors. One day, Danny woke up in some barn far out of town, and when he got home with great difficulty, he found out that he had given his apartment to his new friends, and for nothing. It was clear that they had drugged Danny, so he did not even remember how he had signed the document. The realtor friends quickly changed the locks and refused to let Danny back in, warning him that he'd rather walk out of here now on his own 2 feet than suddenly find himself in a wheelchair later. Danny was terribly angry at first and went to the police, hoping to make things right, get his apartment back and put the bastards behind bars for good, but no such luck. The guy didn't know that the local officials themselves were in league with the realtors, so helping them was simply unprofitable. Once on the street, Danny wandered around for a long time, sleeping both outdoors and in short-term homeless shelters, in general, wherever life forced him. Surprisingly, the other vagrants took to Danny very calmly. No one was oppressing him or demanding that he move out of their territory. So the boy lived in the status of a homeless person for several years, constantly changing his place of residence. He had recently settled in the basement of an apartment building not far from the forest. Here he made himself a kind of apartment and lived in it successfully and quietly, without being rowdy or attracting the attention of the locals. Sitting on the bench now, worried about his dashed hopes, Danny involuntarily thought how good it would be to get drunk, to take away this dull heartache and longing. But he had no money for good cognac, and drinking bad cognac meant saying goodbye to his health, which the young man did not want at all. Gradually, Danny grew more and more angry and wanted to take revenge. But to whom? Not himself for his own stupidity and gullibility. Looking around the parking lot in front of the mall, the vagabond did not even immediately believe in his luck. The thing was, in one of the spaces was the same sous vide the swamp bastard had broken into. Danny could tell by the dent left on the trunk and the broken headlight, which he hadn't had time to fix overnight. The homeless guy remembered the license plate well, too. There goes that bastard's car. Well, now we'll find out who that girl was and why I had to suffer such humiliation today because of these rich people's games, Danny thought to himself while he looked for the owner of the SUV. These rich people are too rich to play with people like toys. But that's all right. I'll make him answer for everything. A few minutes later, the young man really came out of the mall and headed for his car. Danny had already hidden behind the car and was on the lookout for the rascal. When the owner of the car pressed the alarm button to open the car, the homeless man jumped out of his hiding place like a silent bobcat and grabbed the driver by the collar of his leather jacket. "You didn't expect to see me here, did you, you bastard?" Danny asked the major gloatingly, and he clutched at him like a pincer. It seemed to him that anger, a sense of injustice, was about to flood over him. "What's the matter with you? What do you want from me, man?" The driver of the SUV exclaimed, trying to push him away. But this time the young homeless man was determined to go all the way. "I need to know who you tried to drown in that swamp. Who was the girl? Your wife or just a mistress? With whom you have so much fun than cheating simpletons like me?" The guy looked at him with a look of incomprehension. "Are you out of your mind? What are you talking about? What the hell, wife? What mistress? Let me out of here, for Christ's sake. Let's talk normally." But Danny couldn't stop. He only squeezed the major's neck harder with his hands, which he'd already reached. "If you don't tell me, I'll go to the police and tell them everything," said Danny. And he felt the driver try to loosen his grip on his throat. "It doesn't feel good, does it? Does it hurt? It didn't hurt when that guard grabbed me. It didn't hurt when all my dreams fell apart because of you two filthy rich men. The cops might not believe me, but they'll bleed you to death during the interrogation. And then they'll find something on you anyway. I'm sure a bastard like you has plenty of skeletons in his closet. At the same second, Danny abruptly let the Major out of his hands, and the driver of the SUV slowly sat down on the asphalt of the parking lot, gulping air with his mouth wide open like a fish. He was terrified, but not so terrified that he'd run right out of here, abandoning his expensive car. Well, you're... Slowly gathering his strength, said the Major. You're a desperate man. A minute later, the guy explained, so she divorced you too. He looked at Danny with sadness in his eyes. Well, I guess I'll have to tell you after all. Let's go sit in my car. It's going to be a long story. Danny didn't really want to get in the ESUV, but he didn't have much choice. Don't worry, I won't do anything to you, with a sad smile. The Major reassured him. I just have to go one more place, so I'll tell you everything on the way. As the huge car drove out of the parking lot and gently rolled along the wide road, the young man who, as it turned out, was Andrew Brophy, began his unhappy tale. I didn't bring that bitch to that swamp for nothing, Andrew said cautiously. Claire came to our house a year and a half ago. She came for a job interview as a kind of maid. She was so beautiful and gentle and modest, and of course my brother and I took her in. Ethan is 2 years younger than me, so he took notice of this Claire right away. It was like she was just waiting for that. After she moved in, she started ogling me and my brother, and then she and Ethan started having an affair. Andrew gripped the steering wheel tightly before he continued. There was unparalleled rage on his face. I knew right away that something wasn't right here. I kept trying to tell my brother that you shouldn't mess with her. I don't know. Sometimes I think she's got him under a spell of her feminine charms. The young rich man was silent for a while, and then he spoke again. Danny could see that he was having a hard time dealing with his own feelings. My brother and I grew up without parents. Well, our mother died in childbirth, and my father only had time to put us on our feet. I was 21, and Ethan was 19 when my dad died, having a heart attack. Having his face darkened even more. He'd handed over the business to us, and it was just as bad for him. So Claire isn't the rich heiress she told me she was? Danny clarified. Andrew grinned sadly. How do you see that? What do you mean? The homeless man didn't understand. Ever since she and Ethan started dating, Andrew explained. It's like my brother's been replaced. I suspect she's been trying to sick him on me quietly and unobtrusively. We started fighting specifically, mostly because of Claire. My brother told me that I didn't understand anything, that I'd never experienced feelings like that I didn't know what true love was. Danny just nodded understandingly. Sounds like those words were put into his head. What am I talking about? Andrew exclaimed. But that was just the beginning, as it turned out. Ethan had started drinking and playing cards, and at first the two of us were just kind of playing for fun, but poker and stuff like that. And then I found out that he'd been losing all our money in an underground casino for 3 months now. And Claire was the one who encouraged him to do everything. We almost lost the family business because of his debts, but we got away with it. When they stopped at a traffic light, Andrew, for a minute, covered his face with his hands, as if trying to ward off difficult memories. Ethan had managed to marry the bastard and put her in our family mansion, so she definitely had some of his money now. She was bragging, saying her brother had managed to get his will included. The light turned green and they drove on. Andrew was nearing the tragic end of his story. A month ago, Ethan had been killed in a car crash while driving drunk from that damn casino. It's not hard to guess who put him up to it. Claire wanted to run away when she became a rich widow, but I caught her and took her to those woods. The man looked thoughtfully into the distance. I confess there was a moment when I was ready to drown her in a fit of rage. I hate her for what she did to my family, and yet I couldn't. Danny, I'm not a murderer. Looking at my new acquaintance, Andrew said. I just wanted to scare her into never doing anything like that again. Do you understand? The homeless man nodded sympathetically. It's all right, Andrew. Thank you for telling me. Now at least I understand who this girl is and why she did this to me. The rich man laughed bitterly. Except that she still ran away, and now who knows? Maybe she is looking for a new victim. How many more rich fools like me and my brother are there? I should have kicked her out back then, but I had no idea that behind her innocent exterior was such a cold-blooded monster. Danny truly empathized with the rich man, despite the fact that only half an hour ago he himself was ready to strangle him. He liked Andrew. The homeless man saw that the young businessman was honest with him, and that Danny himself was just a victim of other people's squabbles, a random character in this sad and somewhat grim story. There was, in fact, nothing for him to be offended by. Andrew looked at the tramp more closely and noticed that he and Danny were almost the same age. The rich man was very uncomfortable that he had made Danny so worried about him and that thing Claire, so he offered. "Look, Danny, I can't promise you a Lexus. I don't have one myself. But if you want, you can stay at my estate in the servants' quarters. I really need a gardener right now, one who can trim the trees in the garden and clean the trees in the garden and clean the yard. I'll pay you well by the hour, and if you don't find that offensive, you're welcome." The homeless man thought for a minute, then agreed. "Why not? We had a small garden in the orphanage. I used to trowel in it. I think I can manage in your garden." Andrew was glad that Danny accepted his offer, so he ordered his assistants to help the homeless man to move his things to the mansion the very next day. Chuck moved in following his master. The former homeless man asked permission to build an ice kennel for the dog, and the rich man laughingly agreed. "Great. Did you also bring me a guard dog with you? Well done, Danny. Now I am absolutely sure that no thief will break into my house." Chuck, in response to Andrew's words, proudly and a little bit embarrassed, barked, "Don't doubt. I can do more than that." It was the second month since Danny had worked as a gardener at the Brophy mansion. He was already used to get up every morning at 6:00 and first thing in the morning to drink fragrant hot coffee, which was prepared for all the employees by the head cook of the house, Elizabeth Hudson. The young man performed his duties diligently and made sure that the rich man's blooming garden remained so for the most part. Danny enjoyed tinkering with the plants and the soil. He felt a kind of peace in it, the nature of which he could not fully explain. All he knew was that his life was beginning to get better. And for the first time in years, Danny thought that maybe all was not lost for him yet. Andrew worked round the clock, coming home only in the late evening, and sometimes even at night and in his office. Danny could only admire such a phenomenal work capacity of the businessman. He did not know anything about this business himself. Sometimes Andrew's fiancée Irene came to visit them. The girl worked with him in the same company and was very kind and decent. The gardener had time to notice. The businessman loved her very much. Their feelings were not different, but the way he and Andrew looked at each other told Danny a lot about the true nature of their relationship. Danny himself had almost always been single. In his youth, he had tried to date girls, but they all wanted something incredible, vivid from him. And what could a young orphan who had just graduated from the orphanage offer, except for walks in the park and ice cream? But that was considered childish and frivolous in the eyes of those beauties. One day, Danny had to go to town to get some gardening tools, and there, sitting in a small dining room, he suddenly noticed a familiar face behind the glass on the street that gave him the creeps in his knees. "Hello, Savior." Claire grinned in greeting as Danny came out to her. "How have you been? Heard you got a job with Andrew. Not a bad career move. What do you want?" The gardener sharply interrupted her. "Isn't it enough that you tricked me last time? Or have you come to laugh again?" Danny looked at the girl sternly, without the slightest shadow of a smile on his face. Claire was smiling and seemed happy. But in her eyes, the man knew she was up to something and had appeared in front of this cafe for a reason. "Why are you still mad at me for the whole car thing?" "You should be. I really would have given you the Lexus if I had it. But you had at least one day to live with the hope of a happy future. What are you looking at me for?" "I had to get away somehow, so I made it all up, especially since I wasn't lying. I really do have money from my late husband, except it runs out very, very fast." Danny just shook his head slowly. I can't believe I could fall for your looks like a fool. Andrew told me all about you. You, Claire, are a real snake, and without oil in the soul. The beautiful face of the girl took on a sour expression. Oh, please listen to Andrew. He'll tell you a lot more about me. It's not my fault Ethan was drunk out of his mind. If he'd kept it together, he'd still be alive. My God, you're a born actress. It dawned on Danny. Is that why Brother Andrew fell in love with you? You can play any emotion you want. Claire fluttered her eyelashes and smiled broadly. Thank you. It's nice to meet someone who appreciates your talent. Then her face grew serious and she said, Tell you what, Danny, I know we got off to a bad start, but I can make it up to you. I can give you so much money that you won't have to work for the rest of your life. I'll make you rich if you want. I need your help. I can't do without you. Danny was immediately alarmed. But just in case, he clarified. Why the sudden generosity? Do you want something from me again? Claire put her hand on his shoulder and told him confidentially in his ear. You see, Andrew changed all the locks in the house, and now I can't enter his mansion. Help me to get into the mansion. I'll tell you when, and you let me in the back door. It'll only take a minute or two. I'll give you a fat percentage of what I get for some of the documents he keeps in his safe. Danny pulled away from the girl roughly. His eyes were filled with righteous anger. Fuck you, Danny told her in a huff. Are you trying to set me up too? It wasn't enough to set me up once and you want more. The ex-homeless man felt himself begin to shake with anger. And if I'd known who you were before, I'd never have believed that Andrew had pity on you and didn't drown you in that swamp. Because even I have trouble controlling myself now. Or I'd have hit you hard, I swear. You, how rude, said a scornful Claire. I thought you were smarter than that, but you're just like everyone else, dancing to the tune of that rich jerk, ready to sell yourself to him for pennies on the dollar. Danny saw no point in continuing this conversation. The man turned around in silence and hurried back to the bus stop where the transport to the cottage village, where Andrew lived, was just about to leave. When the gardener looked back a while later, Claire was no longer near the cafe. What a bastard. Danny did not stop resenting himself. He had lost his conscience to offer me such a thing. Unfortunately, the man did not know that Claire, being a really good actress, only pretended that she did not care about Danny's insult. In fact, the girl held a great grudge against him and had no intention of backing down from her original plan, to rob Andrew's house. The only thing she regretted a little was that she would have to act much harder now. In the hustle and bustle of work, Danny somehow got wound up and forgot to tell Andrew about his meeting with the crook, and then thought that the young businessman did not need to know about it. He would only get upset saying that he had changed the locks anyway, so nothing bad could happen. How wrong Danny was. Just a couple of days later, Claire guessed the moment when the businessman would go on a business trip to a neighboring city, and the house would be left without the owner's supervision. Late at night, the girl broke into the estate with her accomplices. They put the guards to sleep almost immediately, injected them with a horse dose of sleeping pills, and the muscular men fell asleep like babies. Dressed in all black, they acted like the most professional thieves of the house. As they passed the courtyard, the criminals went straight into the house, but at that second, an enraged Chuck blocked their path. The dog growled loudly and bared its teeth, blocking the villain's way. Danny, who had been asleep that day in a small chaise lounge under the open sky, immediately woke up, and when he saw uninvited guests in their yard, he immediately engaged in an unequal fight with the bandits. 3 against 2, Danny and Chuck fought Claire and her 2 accomplices, who fought so skillfully that the gardener even wondered if these guys were from a private security company. The gardener recognized the girl, however, almost immediately by the blonde hair that poked out of her dark mask and the distinctive high-pitched timbre of her voice. Claire, as it turned out, had a degree in karate and was far from as weak as her fragile appearance screamed about it. She tried to kick Danny in the head, but he dodged it, and at that moment Chuck jumped right on top of her, knocking the villain to the ground. A moment later there was a faint screech in the darkness. "Chuck!" Danny shouted as hard as he could. trying to throw the two big guys off him at the same time. Claire must have done something to his dog, because the lifeless silhouette of his four-legged pet loomed in the grass. Immediately, a bright light flashed in the house. Loud screams woke the housekeeper, who had her own room in the owner's house, and Constance Summers immediately called the police when she saw what was going on in their yard. "Shit, let's go," Claire hissed to her partners. But in the end, she ran up to Danny and stabbed him in the side with something very sharp in one swift movement. Girls shouldn't be hurt. Haven't you heard? They can be very vindictive. She whispered to him, and then she disappeared easily into the darkness. The dazed gardener did not immediately realize what had happened to him. He only had time to put his hand over the wound, but the blood had already trickled to the ground. "Chuck, help." Danny wheezed and dropped dead on the ground. Several maids, a cook, and an elderly plumber poured out into the yard at once. The latter, noticing Danny and his dog lying on the ground, immediately called an ambulance and a veterinarian. Fortunately, Chuck wasn't hurt that badly. Unlike his brave owner, Claire only managed to slash the dog with her long, thin knife across the sternum without hitting any vital organs. Chuck was supposed to recover in a few weeks, so Danny had some peace of mind in that regard. The gardener, on the other hand, had a lot more to worry about. The girl had managed to drive the blade so deep that they pierced through the man's right kidney. Plus, the formerly homeless man had lost too much blood. Urgent surgery was needed for a donor organ transplant and 2 blood transfusions. When Andrew was informed of this, he immediately took the first flight home and rushed to the hospital. After learning that his faithful gardener had only a few hours to live, and the donor centers, as if by chance, were now completely empty, the businessman agreed without a second thought to give him his own kidney. Up to this point, the housekeeper managed to tell the young rich man that burglars had attacked their house. However, Danny and Chuck gave them such a fight that they fled from their yard, flashing their heels, and all the valuables, including those very important Andrew documents, were left lying in the safe. This guy not only saved my reputation, he saved my entire fortune and business, Andrew thought at the time, preparing for the operation. With one kidney, I will live, but if I let him die, I will not be able to live a single day in peace. The organ transplant surgery and blood transfusion were successful. The donor's kidney had taken root in Danny's body perfectly. However, when Andrew regained consciousness in his room, a couple of hours later, he saw the doctor's concerned face in front of him. "What happened?" weakly asked Andrew. "Is Danny all right? Is he alive?" "Yes," the doctor nodded. "Andrew, we didn't want to tell you right away. We decided to wait a few days and then double. Check everything to make sure the results were as objective as possible." "What is it?" The businessman frowned. The doctor chewed his lips for a while before he decided to tell him the truly incredible news. "You see, the thing is, during the operation, it turned out that you and your gardener—" "What? Come on, son," the businessman rushed him. "It turns out that you and Danny Whitmore are brothers. To be precise, you're twins." Inside Andrew's heart felt like it had stopped for a few brief moments. Can this not be a mistake? How is this possible? But the doctor, alas, had no answer to that question. But an old family friend and loyal companion of Andrew's father for the past 30 years. Dersh Wilson went to the hospital to see the young man and told him everything. "Your mother Beatrice died in childbirth. That's right. But already after that, your little brother was snatched from the hospital. I'm only finding out about this now." Andrew was angry, but he groaned in pain. The after-effects of the surgery were taking their toll. "Unfortunately, your father ordered me to keep quiet about it, and I kept quiet all my life." The elderly businessman replied with a sigh. "You never would have known about it if it weren't for this incident. But why wasn't anyone looking for my brother?" Andrew wondered. "His trail was lost almost immediately after he disappeared," Wilson explained. "Your father's rivals had hoped to keep the boy so they could raise him and use him against you and your company in the future. But we learned that later. At the time, no one would have thought they could have come up with such an elaborate plan. So what? Why did my brother live most of his life on the streets? Brophy asked harshly. No one knows. With a shrug, his companion answered. All we could find out was that at some point the rivals had changed their game, and the subject of your brother had lost its relevance. Then apparently they just sold the boy to some childless couple. They ended up drinking and dying, and Danny ended up in an orphanage. I'm sorry it happened that way. The businessman shook his head sympathetically. I hope you don't fire me now that you know the truth. Of course, Andrew was not that cruel and let the old family friend go in peace. But he was shocked at the mere realization that he had had another brother all along. Ethan was born later to a woman with whom his father had not lived long, but his mother had run away. It was worth her while to make sure that Brophy would take care of all of the boy's upbringing. That is why Pamela was not mentioned in their family. Her father considered her unworthy even of memory. In the meantime, in the other room, Danny gradually began to come to his senses. He spent the next few weeks slowly recovering from the surgery, and he was helped by Samantha, a charming young nurse who cared for Danny in a way that probably no one had in his entire life. The young men talked a lot, and soon felt a quiet and beautiful feeling begin to bud in each of their souls, like a delicate lotus flower. When Andrew gathered his strength and told the gardener the whole truth about their kinship, Danny was for some time under a huge impression from what he had heard. It was no less difficult for him to believe that he and this rich and educated man, blood relatives, and not even just relatives, but brothers of one twin. Of course, I could never have imagined anything like that. Slowly, Danny looked his brother over from head to toe again in a different, new way now. But I'm immensely glad it's true, Andrew. You gave me your kidney, so we're brothers now anyway, no matter what that genetic test says. That's right, little brother. Andrew laughed lightly, but it's so nice to know that you and I helped each other. And if it hadn't been for you, that thing, Claire, would have stolen incredibly valuable information from me, and it would have meant the end of my whole business for me. The police were already on the hunt for her and her accomplices, and pretty soon Claire was caught. As it turned out, she had been living in an old hotel on the outskirts of town, in the poorest, most inconspicuous place in the whole town. Danny was right. The other two robbers were indeed from a private security organization, except that they had been fired long ago for letting themselves get involved with crime, counting on quick and big money. Claire, on the other hand, during the interrogation revealed all her cards. It turned out that she, too, had been sabotaging millionaires for a reason. Their daddy, Brophy, Sir, was a real jerk. Claire told the cops in a defiant tone. My mother asked him for a decent sum of money, and he wouldn't give a cent. The bastard. My mother didn't ask for it for herself. But for me, I was weak from childhood, and the doctor said that if I did not have an operation in time, I could stay lame for life. But the operation was insanely expensive. So my mother tried to ask Nicholas Brophy for money. The girl took a breath and finished. She'd been his maid for 5 years. He could have splurged once for the baby's treatment. But no, he was a man of principle. He never lent money to anyone. And my mother ended up borrowing the money for the surgery from one authority figure. Naturally, he didn't wait for her to collect it. He didn't care who she was or how she lived, practically unemployed with a small child. I had the operation, but my mother was killed 2 months later, stabbed to death in an alley on her way home from work. Claire's face lit up with a malicious grin. I promised myself I'd get back at those bastards, all of them. I grew up in a boarding school for physically gifted kids. I'd spent my whole life practicing martial arts, wondering how I could come up with a plan to bury this whole family. And so when the time came, I infiltrated them. This hornet's nest. Also under the guise of a maid, as my mother had once done. The older one was too smart to suspect anything. But the younger one, I got even with him. Claire had a trial and a very long prison sentence ahead of her. Just because her motives were noble, it did not take away from the gravity of all the crimes she had committed. Danny, however, as soon as he was discharged from the hospital, began to live in his brother's house legally, not as a servant. Chuck soon recovered, and an even better kennel was put up for him. In gratitude for his dedication and loyalty to his master and the protection of the entire Brophy home, Andrew and Danny agreed that the brother businessman would send his blood relative to study, first at a college in the capital and then for a year abroad for an apprenticeship. This way, Danny will learn everything he needs to run a business, and he and his brother will be able to continue their family business. Danny started dating Samantha, that nurse from the hospital, and after 6 months of a tender and beautiful relationship, he proposed to her. He saw in Samantha the life partner he had always dreamed of, and after the wedding, he never regretted his choice. By the way, he and Andrew were married on the same day, having 2 luxurious, lavish weddings. Andrew married his fiancée Irene and felt like the happiest man in the world. Now both couples have a wonderful life ahead of them, full of family joys and professional accomplishment. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel, like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.